Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's dive into today's episode. 3 ways to be powerful. Many of you know my story about finding my voice, and I want to give you 3 things today to help you to step into your power. One of the ways that came up for me was related to a story a friend told me about her business many years ago. And I love this example because she was talking about this, working with this client. It was when she had first started her coaching business. And the client was pretty wealthy, had a pretty big platform. And she made some allusion to, or she alluded to, I shouldn't say allusion, she alluded to something about being a powerful person, a powerful woman, and that's great. But someone else might have been inclined to be a little bit intimidated by that and to almost fawn over her, say, oh, I'm so lucky to have this potential client. She's a very wealthy person, da, 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 da. What my friend said is, here are the ways that I'm powerful. And I just thought, whoa, isn't that awesome? If we could all stand in that truth and be so grounded in the fact that we are powerful, each one of us, you are powerful. As you're listening to this, think about the ways that you could be more powerful. You could leverage that power for good as well. So the 3 things, I'm going to tell you the 3 for those of you that like the bottom line. And then we're going to walk through each one of these with some examples and some practical tips that I have you. And by the way, this is my 50th episode, so time to celebrate. Thank you so much for celebrating with me. And for those of you that have been following me and listening to these podcast episodes, I'm very grateful. The first way to be powerful is to use your voice. The second is to trust yourself. The third is to set boundaries. I continue to learn about that one all the time. Okay, let's talk about use your voice. This one I could spend, and probably have already, multiple episodes on. This is what I coach people on all the time. But what I want you to think about here is the tactical way that you use your voice. Starting there will already elevate your power. Think about your voice as your entire body working for you. Start with projection, for example. Think about ways, because too often what happens is, especially as women, we tend to speak a little tentatively. We might not speak with total conviction. We might be hesitant or halting in our speech patterns, and we don't even realize it. Another thing that happens a lot with women in particular is we get into this breathy tone where we really want you to take part in this great experience that we're having, and we become someone else. Now, this does happen with men too, but unfortunately, women in particular get a bad rap for it. We don't realize we're doing this breathy, almost dramatic tone. We've got to be careful about that. You want to think about projecting from your gut. That's that beautiful muscle called the diaphragm right around your stomach. That is where you want your whole body to be working for you to project and support your voice. I heard a great tip today that I hadn't heard before, which is to lay on your back on the bed, for example, or perhaps on a couch. I would recommend a bed, and feel the groundedness that bed does to support you. And that might feel maybe a little strange for some of us, some of us compared to others, perhaps, but really focus on that bed supporting you and practice speaking, laying down, and see how it feels, just as an experiment. All of this is really an experiment. We want to be careful with all these things too, to not take it so seriously. We've got to have some levity. Try that out and then stand up and imagine feeling the weight of that bed, almost like the weight of someone's hands behind you. And I believe that this this comes from somatic body work, body healing. That's a way to think about remembering that your whole body is supporting your voice to project. Because too often, let's say, have you ever been in a concert and maybe you're yelling, you're like, yeah, yeah, that comes from your throat. potentially your chest, throat, voice. That is not going to be able to sustain you for very long. Your voice is going to start to get sore, your throat, etc. That's also why you want to think about projecting from the diaphragm. But most importantly, as far as how it comes across, which is what we're talking about here, related to influence, persuasion, and people wanting to continue listening to you, is to have that nice, rich tone. You can hear now, I'm really speaking from my diaphragm. This is the lower tone that I have, but I could go higher and speak like this. And now you're hearing me speaking from my throat, and that's going to kill me after a while. And it will kill you too. So think about projecting your voice. The other part of this, what I said for tip 1 was use your voice. Projection is one thing. The other thing is simply to actually use it, meaning speak up. Talk when you want to. Now, we've also got to have discernment. I heard this story the other day where somebody said, this woman was saying, anytime you feel the urge, you should speak up. You should say whatever you think at any time. And what we've got to remember here is that it's important to speak up when it's appropriate, but there might be times when you might actually sabotage yourself if you speak up. If you're just, flipping out the mouth, I was like, what is the phrase for that? When you're just speaking to speak, or you're trying to be difficult, or you're just, I'm going to just jump in here and interrupt because I think it's important to use my voice. That's not going to come across with much credibility. You want to have discernment, you want to have good judgment, and you want to know when is it appropriate for me to speak up. It's going to help me to share what I want to share, be heard in a way that resonates with my audience, whether it's an audience of one or whether it's an audience of many. And how am I going to come across? I don't want you to overthink this either, but it is important to remember that using our voice comes with discernment and knowing what the situation is and when it's appropriate. One of the things that I talk about a lot, which many of you know who are listening to me on a regular basis, is the importance of speaking up when you have an idea or an opinion and you get that almost gut reaction. Oh, I have something to say here. And as Mel Robbins talks about in her book, The 5-Second Rule, oftentimes we get that immediate urge to speak, or it might be in other situations where she talks about, you hear the alarm in the morning, you've made it a goal to get up and work out. But if you wait 5 seconds, you hit snooze, you're probably going to be screwed at that point because you'll probably stay back in bed. So similarly, with our voice, we want to make sure that we are using it and speaking up when we get that urge and there's judgment and discernment in it. Now, the other thing when we use our voice, I'm giving you a little bit of everything today, by the way, folks. When we use our voice, we want to be thinking about what is the point? What is the lead of my story? And what I mean by that is simply, what is the point of what I want to get out there? Because if we start talking and we're rambling, we're on tangents, or we're not getting to the point, we're not going to come across in the best way that represents us. Too often that happens, and I have seen it with people. I've experienced it with myself. And the story that for me is a very powerful moment that I had was when I was in front of a group of peers on a senior leadership team, presenting something, or about to present, I should say, that my boss recommended that we do. And it had been months prior. It got a little bit fuzzy as to why we were presenting this or why this was relevant. And I did not question it, which I should have because my gut said to do that. But I didn't. And I ended up at this meeting feeling so paralyzed, not just feeling, but actually being paralyzed with my speech, that I could not get myself to come out with any words that made a lot of sense. And I had my colleagues that really respected me jumping in to try to save me. And then ultimately my boss said, hey, why don't we table this and come back to it later? And then she's the one that pulled me into her office and said, this is another example where you didn't trust your gut. This is something that has happened quite a bit. And I want to remind you, you could have looked at that situation and here's how it could have been different. You could have said, I don't even know why we started talking about this a few months ago, and I'm still a little bit confused about it. Let's table it. or maybe I wouldn't say confused about it, but just I'm unclear. Let's table this. I didn't even think that was an option. I thought, well, I have to do what my boss says. So this is a good example of moving into the step number 2, or rather the way number 2, which is to trust yourself. I'm sure you've had the situation where you have felt something in your gut about a situation, either good or not so good. Maybe you just felt like something's not right here. I don't know what it is. I can't put my finger on it. And I was reminded just today, the power of that quote that Brene Brown says, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. We've got to remember that when things are fuzzy or we feel confused, it's probably because things are unclear and we need to get clarity. Trust yourself to bring that to the table. If it's a business deal, if it's simply something that you were asked to do, perhaps maybe at work or with a client, and you just felt like, this doesn't quite feel right. I myself had an unusual situation recently where I was going to be doing something in partnership, collaboration with someone else. And it was very clear to me the value that I was providing to this person, but it was not clear to me the value that I was getting even after multiple conversations. So still in conversations around that, but most likely it is not going to work out. And what was fascinating about that to me that I continue to learn is that I kept thinking, this is just so unclear. I want to do this. It sounds exciting. It sounds interesting, but I can't seem to get a really direct answer with things laid out in a contract of here's what we're going to do for you. And I found myself wondering, well, it's that whole, when you start doubting yourself, or you're wondering, am I doing something wrong here, or not wrong, but just what is it? It's my place as far as the responsibility goes in this. But it was such a good reminder to trust myself, to know that, and I'd say this to you too, be grounded and know that you know best for yourself. You can trust yourself. It's so easy to look to other people that we might think know more than us. We might think they're in more of an authority position than us, perhaps in the corporate world, or somebody that is in a higher position in our organization. And that's often what I thought in my career. Well, they must know better than me. And I would diminish myself, diminish my value. And I am not doing that anymore. And I also want the same for you. Remember, you know what you need to know. And you are so much stronger than you think. You have so much more expertise than you think. And this is such a good example too, related to how often women don't raise their hand for opportunities unless they feel 100% or even overqualified for something. I can still remember, I was fortunate in this area. I can remember when I was a little kid, my dad used to take me to flea markets, and I loved that. He would give me a couple dollars. He couldn't get much for that anymore, but he would give me a couple dollars, and he would tell me to go to the booths and not take the full price. So I learned how to negotiate at an early age. And it's interesting that when we were all complex human beings, because on one hand, there were many ways that I didn't find my voice, specifically times where I felt like I couldn't be myself because I needed to be accepted or approved of or gotten permission from someone else to be a certain way. But my dad taught me a very valuable lesson, which is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if you don't ask, you won't get. That has served me really, really well in life. So I have gone through a number of situations where many people don't ask, but I do. And I've gotten really good results from that. So I want to remind you that you are amazing and people are lucky to be around you. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way. I mean that in a way to really own your value, know your worth. So my third way today about ways to be powerful is to set boundaries. This is such a good example for those of you that are entrepreneurs and you're setting your fees. For those of you also in the corporate world and you're negotiating fees or rates as well, but it could be anything. It could be in your personal life. Know what you will say yes to and what you will say no to. And I have to remind you, no is a complete sentence. You don't have to say all the reasons why you're not doing something. And one of the examples that comes up for me, which was earlier in my career, when I first left corporate and I started my career coaching business at the time, I remember my group of friends, that was in my late 20s, early 30s, they were used to me reviewing their resumes because I'm in HR. That's what I did then. And that would be a natural thing for people to think. And I did it. I helped people with that. I enjoyed helping my friends with that. Well, when I left corporate to start my own business, I remember a friend of mine asked me if I could review her resume. That was a tough one. This was one of the hardest conversations I had. It was one of the first ones where I was really putting that stake in the ground, saying no to someone that I normally wouldn't have said no to. So I had a mentor, a therapist at the time, who encouraged me with some language around how to address it. And it was hard, but I got through it, and I'm still here to talk about it today. So here's what happened. She asked me if I would review her resume, and I came back to her after seeing this therapist mentor after our session and called my friend, and I said, hey, I would love to help you with that. That is now what I do for a living since I left my corporate job. So I would be happy to do it for you for this rate. And it was so scary to say that, but it felt so good to do that, to put that stake in the ground and say, this is what I charge. And she didn't end up hiring me, which I didn't expect she would. But at the time, I came up with a really good compromise that would still serve her and wouldn't cost me a dime. I actually said, I'd be happy to send you my resume and you can use it as a template. So that worked out really well. Lots of different ways that we don't set boundaries. A lot of times, have you ever said yes to something that you wish that you hadn't, and then you end up regretting it or you're resentful? I see this all the time, especially with women saying, oh yeah, I'll do that. And I'll do that. And there was a story of this woman actually who said she saw somebody walking out of the grocery store and she was in her car and she needed to go to somewhere, wherever she was going. But the woman had all of these bags that she was juggling. And somehow the woman in the car felt like I should go out and help her. And then she had to stop herself and say, I've got to go and do things. I'm carrying a bunch of my own bags. I can't help somebody else with all of her bags. So that's also really important to remember is, are you carrying the appropriate amount of bags, or some people call it baggage, suitcases, whatever you want to call it? Are you carrying that for yourself, or are you carrying somebody else's that you don't need to be carrying? And that's a really good question to think about. One of the things that I would invite you to consider is the simple question as you go about your days in the next week or so. Ask yourself, when things come across your desk or come across your phone or whatever, wherever they're coming across where you're making decisions, yes or no, ask yourself, who's responsible for this? Am I do I need to be responsible for this? Or is someone else, or could someone else be responsible for it? This is a great thing too for you leaders in the corporate world to delegate. Ask yourself, do I really need to do this? Too often we end up hoarding things unintentionally because we want it to be done right. We want to be in control. We don't want to take the time to train somebody. And boy, I get that for sure. But if we take the time and we stop and remember that the time that we spend now training someone might be longer, but for the long game, the end game, it's actually going to be it's going to be a time saver. So those are some things to consider with setting boundaries. Really asking yourself, and I just find it fascinating to ask, what am I responsible for? And not just, that's a little ethereal, but when something does, that I'm confronted with a situation, to ask, is my knee-jerk reaction to say yes? That's probably the case for a lot of you listening. Ask yourself, or more importantly, tell yourself, every time I'm faced with a decision, start with your knee-jerk reaction in the next week to be no. Just in your head, start there. What would it feel like to try that on? I'm going to say no, and then see what happens. That would be a really great exercise to start that muscle. And then you can start actually saying it out loud for times when you feel like you need to say no and you want to say no. The other thing related to boundaries is the very important thing to remember is that you have the power to choose. You've got to embrace the self-agency that you have, that I have, that we all have. But a lot of times we look to other people for permission and we don't even realize it. And what I continue to learn, especially working with women, is how many women have felt this need to ask for permission. And I am not a psychologist. I will say from my experience, a lot of it does seem to come from our childhood and the people that I've spoken to. And for me, certainly, my dad was the authority. You do what he says, and that's the way it is. So there's this feeling a lot of times of we need to ask for permission. So I'm going to suggest that you say, no, I'm choosing to do this thing and I trust myself. So if we go back and recap, 3 ways for you to be powerful. Number 1, use your voice, both projection, conviction, and the mechanical way that we use our voice, remembering that our body supports that voice, as well as actually speaking up, the act of speaking up, having a point, moving the conversation forward. The second one is to trust yourself. Remember that you know best for you. Be grounded in what you think is best for you. And you can't go wrong with trusting your gut. If something feels wrong or feels fuzzy, it probably is. Remember, you have also the right to clarify. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And the third way to be powerful is to set boundaries. Know your worth and make sure that you ask for what you need, also in your relationships, emotionally, as well as in business. What is it that's going to work or not work for you? And in fact, I love that phrase, that's not going to work for me. It depends on the situation, but it can be a really wonderful, direct way. If you're going back and forth with someone and perhaps things aren't working and you finally just say, you know what, that decision is not going to work for me. I'm making another choice. But thank you for asking. If you want to say thank you for asking, you don't have to. Keeping these things in mind with these techniques that are small, but actually big, having those sentence prompts at the ready. What is it that you need to have at the ready that's going to help you be prepared for that next situation where when you are in the moment, you'll be ready to respond in a way that honors who you are and what you need. Remember, we don't have to be always looking and searching for, not like we're searching for it, but we don't have to be the person that is responsible for everybody else's needs to get met. We've got to take care of ourselves. So what I would ask you to think about related to boundaries, which is directly connected to getting your needs met, is what do you need right now in this season of your life? And then step 2, who could you ask to get that need met? That can be a very uncomfortable thing. It's hard to ask because it's vulnerable. We don't know if the person is going to say yes or no. But if we ask, at least we've done the asking. That's all that you can do. We can't control the outcome, but we can control the things that we do. So I'm going to say, be powerful, use your voice, trust yourself, and set boundaries. Make sure you know your worth. I'm going to end with one of my favorite stories, which is a proud moment for me. And since today is my 50th episode, I'm going to ask you to indulge me in this. But the month before COVID hit, it was early March, actually, I had almost signed a deal. Yeah, pretty much signed a deal with the company. And I was very excited about it. It was before I officially quit my job after 14 years, by the way. Felt really excited about this contract. It was a pretty big amount of money and it was a one-on-one coaching engagement. And I was super excited. The company was sponsoring, well, they were paying for their employee to go through coaching with me. COVID hit, they decided against it. We're going to hold off. Classic following up, every few months, checking in, nurturing the relationship. And at one point I actually thought there was no hope. But I got a call out of the blue from the person that I was actually going to be coaching. And she said, I really need you. And I've talked to the CEO and he has approved us working together. I said, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Well, I went back and I looked at the contract that I originally presented to them a year and a half now later, going, oh my gosh, I wouldn't have even done it that same way. And why would I package that the way? I mean, again, we're all learning, but I would have packaged it very differently now. I also would have charged about 3 times as much. And I I thought about, why am I going to then propose more money as well as a different arrangement? So I thought of the logic, ended up going back to them and saying a couple of things here. I would love to keep working with the employee, or I'd love to start working with her rather. Number one, I want you to know that it's been a year and a half now, and I continue to learn that changing habits takes time, intention, and support. And as a result of that, I'd like to change up the arrangement because it's going to give her and you as the client that's paying me, obviously, more value. The second thing is, after a year and a half, I am in more demand now. My prices have gone up, and this is now what I charge. And I'll tell you, it felt a little scary because it was technically 2.5 times more than I had. So almost 3 times as much as I had initially proposed and gotten the okay to say yes, or that they said yes about. And I just decided, you know what? This is the way I work now. I trusted myself. I knew my boundaries, and I used my voice, all the 3 things that we've been talking about today. So I said that, let the chips fall where they may. They came back to me and didn't even question it. Said, when can you get started? And not only that, I told them I want full payment up front for the 6 months, and they did it. It's amazing what you can get when you ask. So keep that in mind, folks. I hope that's some inspiration for you to use your voice, trust yourself, and set your boundaries. And that's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.